Hello, Y13s, and this is one of our catch-up lessons on biopsychology, and we're looking at split brain research. So to begin with, what I would like you to do is start on the bronze, silver, and gold. So briefly describe one role of the unconscious according to the psychodynamic approach. Um, Silver, name three behaviors that enable a minority to influence a majority. And then gold, briefly outline how excitation and inhibition are involved in synaptic transmission. So pause the video, answer the questions, give yourself approximately, I would say, 10 minutes max, and then we'll go into the next answers. And before we go into the next slide, let's quickly recap what the learning objectives are. Is to identify and explain hemispheric lateralization, and to evaluate the link between the holistic approach and localization along with lateralization. But these are the green pen answers, so go over your points, correct them, adapt them, amend them if need be, and if you got the correct answers, then give it the appropriate mark or the appropriate tick. Pause the video if you need to. So as we've covered a few lessons on biopsych so far, these questions you should be quite familiar with, or you should be able to answer them. And you don't need to write these down. It's just more so, can you articulate what the right response would be for each question? And if you don't, or if you're unable to, then that's going to be a point of revision for you to go over your notes and become more familiar. First and foremost, what is lateralization? So lateralization is the idea or the notion that that two halves of the brain are functionally different, and we associate different functions with different parts of the brain, but we're going to specify it more so to hemispheres rather than lobes. So before we looked at localization, where we looked at different parts of the brain, where we said, the frontal, temporal, parietal, and so on. Lateralization is going to be primarily based around the hemispheres, and it's important for you to understand the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body, and the left side of our brain controls the right side of the body. And if we look at it through visual information, what we see in our left eye is processed by the right side of the brain, and what we see in our right eye is processed by the left side of the brain. So it's important just to sort of repeat this and become familiar with this sort of separation, because it can be, even though it's quite simple, it can be quite confusing sometimes. So, um, left hemisphere is primarily responsible for language. That's where Broca and Wernicke's areas, is pretty much located. So the left hemisphere is more so associated with language, and the right is more so face recognition, drawing ability, and spatial tasks. So anything which relates to your spatial awareness. But it's important to just continually remember that the language area is more so located on the left hemisphere. So a really simple task: close or cover your right eye, and what would this be a picture of? Um, you would be able to, or I'd hope you'd be able to, see that it is a frog. Um, and the question is, why is it that even though if one eye is covered, you're able to process that information and describe it? This is because, again, because of our lateralized brains, there is a bridge between the two. Okay, there is a bridge between the two, even though our brains are sort of separated between left and right. Right more so for recognition, left more so for language. If we had covered that right eye, we're still able to articulate and see and describe what we're actually seeing. This is because, again, we have what is called the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is um, a bridge between the two hemispheres, and it transports information and what we see and what we do through different parts of the brain. So from left to right, right to left. So our left side of the brain is able to communicate with the right side of the brain. And when we're looking at split brain research or split brain patients, these are individuals who have had their corpus callosum severed. Okay, so it's been destroyed through some sort of surgery, or they're born with it, or they have this potential defect when they're born. Okay, but more often than not, and the majority of times, there's been some sort of corpus colostomy, where there's been an operation which removes that middle bit of the brain which connects the two hemispheres in simple terms. Now, this is again primarily done in order to sort of control and try and restrict the amount of epileptic fits patients were having. And just some possible questions to sort of ponder over: what are the ethical issues when it comes to doing these sort of studies or these sort of operations? Because once it's done, there's no going back. And also, is there going to be or is the cost of the research, does it outweigh the benefit of what is going to be found out? So it's this kind of cost benefit weight that we need to be addressing, and we need to be understanding. Is the operational, is the research we're doing worth all of the ethical issues, all of the physical damage in which patients will go through, and so on and so on. So we're always trying to compare this cost benefit sort of balance. Key study, Berry, 1968. So he wanted to investigate what functions of the brain are lateralized, and he compared split brain patients to others with no hemispheric separation. So again, those who had a normal corpus callosum intact and their brains were working kind of fine. There was no sort of severed bridge between the two, to those who had split brain operations. And they were given different activities. Some were based around touching, explaining, describing what objects were in front of them, but they would have one part of the eye covered. So all they could see from their left eye is what they could see from their left eye. There was no merging of the two. And they wanted to see as to how easy it would be, because naturally, like we saw before, when I asked you to look at the actual frog, even though you had covered your right eye, you were still able to process that information. This wasn't the case for um, those who had a split brain. They were given either a visual task or a tactile task, or a word or picture is projected into the left or right visual field, and the patient will be asked something about that particular stimuli. A tactile task where they're asked to touch the objects, and it was carried out with the participants' hands underneath the screen, so they couldn't see what they were doing. They could only use their hands to feel. Okay, so if a patient was shown something to their left visual field, what would they say? And if a patient was shown something to their right visual field, what would they say? Okay, bear in mind, remember, the right visual field is controlled by the left hemisphere. Left hemisphere is associated with language. Left visual field controlled by the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere, drawing ability, facial recognition, spatial tasks. So we're always having that sort of conversation in our heads to remind ourselves how it actually works. Okay? But those who had or were looking through the left visual field, they could not describe what they had seen. But bear in mind, left visual field, right hemisphere, nothing to do with language. But even reported that there was nothing there, which was really, really strange. Okay, so those who had their right visual field covered, um, or sorry, those who had their left visual field covered and they were observing things through their right visual field, they could easily describe the picture shown to the right. Okay, so again, just as a simple reminder, those who were observing things through their left visual field only, so their left eye, they were unable to articulate because that connection was broken between the right hemisphere to the left. So they had the information in the right hemisphere, and that was unable, or they couldn't transfer that over to the left hemisphere where they could then articulate the right wording to describe it. Whereas when they were looking at it through the right visual field, the left hemisphere was able to process the information and articulate quite easily because the information was going directly to the language part of the brain. What I'll do is, with this video, I'll put it on the show my homework link or the post so you can watch it yourself. So very simply, if a patient was shown an object in the left visual field, what would happen if they were asked to select the same object? So again, left visual field, right hemisphere. However, they were asked to select the same object from their left hand. So again, still in that same process. Okay, so still in that same order, everything is being processed by the right. So findings were they were able to actually find the object because it was seen in the right hemisphere, and the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, but they couldn't describe the actual object. They couldn't say anything about it. They could work out what it was through the sense of touch, but they couldn't actually articulate what it actually was, which again reiterates the idea that left is to do with the language sort of production, and the right side is again our facial recognition, our awareness, our touch, and so on. Now, if a patient was shown an object on their left visual field, what would happen if they were asked to select the same object from a selection with their right hand? So it's been switched over. What do you think would happen? They would be unable to select the object because it was seen by the right hemisphere, and the right hand is controlled by the left hemisphere. Okay, so they're seeing things through the left visual field, right hemisphere, but they've been asked to pick it up using their right hand, which is controlled by the left. So there was no passing over of information. This will get a bit wordy, and I'm hoping some of you aren't confused. But if you are confused, just read it slowly and calmly, and it will sink in. What would happen if they were holding different objects in each hand? Then the objects were hidden amongst other objects, and the two hands were told to find the objects they were holding. What do you think would happen? And the findings were each hand searches for its own objects, but if the left hand picks up the object which the right hand is looking for, the object is rejected. So, for example, if let's say the left hand picked up an item in which the right hand was familiar with, the participant wouldn't be able to pass on the information from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere to say that you now have the actual item in which I was holding prior. There was no crossing over. They couldn't recognize what either hand was doing or what either hand was familiar with. They would only be familiar with what their hand had touched initially if it was the same hand. I hope that makes sense. So I'll sort of re-explain it. So each hand would search for its own object. So let's say, for example, the right hand had an apple and the left hand had a pen. Okay. And bear in mind, left hand processed right hemisphere, right hand processed by left hemisphere. So if at any point, okay, the right hand had the pen, and we know as we're going through the actual study, we know that the left hand had the pen, but that split brain patient wouldn't be able to transfer over the information and comprehend that this pen was in my left hand at one point, so they would reject it. If the right hand had the apple, then the apple would stay there because the right hand remembers, or the left hemisphere remembers, that this is what I had in my right hand. But if the roles were reversed again and the left hand had the apple, that would be rejected and it wouldn't be passed on over to the right hand because there is no connection between the two hemispheres. Everything is separate. When it came to the drawing situation, a picture is shown, and this is how they did it, to the right or left visual field, and the patient is asked to draw. The drawings were consistently better when drawn by the left hand. And again, this is because the right side of the brain is more so adept to dealing with drawing tasks and is where our drawing ability tends to be. Again, this is despite patients actually being right-handed. Okay, so right-handed, left hemisphere, language. However, regardless of that, those who had split brain or had gone through who had a split brain, they would draw better with the left hand, even though they were right-handed, because again, left hand connects to our right hemisphere, drawing ability. And so this suggests again that the right hemisphere and therefore left was superior at drawing. Composite words. So if a patient was shown two different words to their left and right visual field, what would they say and what would they pick up with their left hand? So for example, they could see through their left visual field the word key and through their right visual field the word ring. Word ring processed by the left, language. Left visual field or the word key processed by the right hemisphere, drawing ability, spatial awareness, element of touch. What would be the outcome? So what they saw through the right hemisphere, they would be able to articulate it. Sorry, what they saw through the right visual field, they would be able to articulate it because it's processed by the left hemisphere. Okay, I'll reword that. Even I get a bit confused sometimes. It's natural because the way that you're wording it, it doesn't seem natural to us to say left, right, left. So it just will take a bit of coaching. But because the right visual field, which is controlled by the left hemisphere, is seeing the word ring, and the left hemisphere controls language, the participant could actually say the word ring. Okay. Now, key, that is being processed by, or that's been taken in by the left visual field, so the left eye, and processed by the right side of the brain. Okay, the right side of the brain, they were able to find it with their left hand. Face recognition. What would happen if they had to name whether they had seen a man or a woman? Bear in mind the female is on the left, male is on the right. As the left deals with language, they would say man's left hemisphere, right eye. They could see the man through the right visual field. Okay, so what would happen if a split brain patient sees this and is asked to pick out a matching photo of what they had seen, but the photos are of a full single face but not a split face? What would be the findings? What do you think? As the right deals with face recognition, they're going to be more likely um, to select the image of the woman. But bear in mind they're seeing it through the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere. So, in summary, his findings were these patients um, sort of reinforce the belief that hemispheres of the brain process information separately. Hemispheres do in fact have different functions, which again supports lateralization and goes against the holistic nature. Okay, and participants seem to have two separate streams of consciousness with their own memories and perceptions, and that corpus callosum is the bridge between the two hemispheres. If that is not intact, then there will be some issues with comprehension and understanding, and as to how they interact or view the world. What I would like you to do is go online and use the login details that I've placed on Show My Homework and summarize the evaluation points and work your way through bronze, silver, and gold, or choose which one that you would like to do, either bronze, silver, or gold. And then we'll talk about it in the next lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on Show My Homework and I will respond. But in the meantime, thank you for watching.